Hello Summoners and welcome back to another ProGuides video. My name is Nathaning and today's video will be our guide to RENATA Glask, the Chem Baroness. RENATA's been out in the PvE for a while now and we've been grinding away testing things out so you don't really have to. In this video we'll be going over her abilities, how she works, and of course her builds. As with most new champions, there have been a lot of players trying to make her work in every single role, but don't fall for their random hyphy clickbait titles. RENATA is not another new OP solo laner. She is absolutely supposed to be played as a support, so that's what this guide will be focusing on. Please do remember, since this guide is based on the PvE, everything is still technically tentative. Changes could happen up to the day of her release, but she should be in a very similar state once her release goes live. In case you aren't familiar with RENATA's kit, we'll be talking about what she does. RENATA's passive is Leverage. Innately, RENATA's basic attacks mark enemies for 6 seconds, dealing a percentage of the target's maximum health as bonus magic damage if they were unmarked. Allied champions damaging attacks and abilities against marked targets consume the mark to deal the same percentage of damage again as additional bonus magic damage. If RENATA attacks an already marked enemy, the mark duration will be refreshed. Marking a different enemy will remove the mark from the previous target. Leverage's damage is capped at 150 against all monsters. Right away we see that RENATA is definitely intended to be a support. This ability gives a lot of extra damage, but you need an ally to trigger it so you can go ahead and reapply the mark when you're hitting a single foe. That said, if your ADC isn't in range when you're trading a lane, you can auto an enemy champion, back up a bit, auto a minion, and then move in again to auto a champion again. This gives you a much stronger tit-for-tat trading on foes. Paying attention to that part of her passive where you can only mark one target at a time is pretty important. When testing on the PvE, we saw many other RENATAs doing attack speed builds, and even one buying Hurricane in an attempt to shoot out marks at the entire enemy team. Well, it doesn't actually work, so you're gonna be wasting a lot of gold on items that do absolutely nothing for you, aside from making you shoot little lasers very fast. RENATA's Q is Handshake. RENATA fires out a hook from her robotic arm in a target direction, dealing magic damage to the first enemy hit, rooting them for 1 second. The target is revealed and RENATA is unable to declare attacks and has her movement speed reduced by 30%. Handshake can be recast as long as the target is rooted. Upon recast, RENATA knocks the target 275 units in the target direction, though they can't be moved through terrain. Any enemies they pass through take the same amount of damage as the initial cast dealt, and if the thrown target is a champion, all targets are stunned for a half second. While all of RENATA's abilities are strong and exciting in their own way, I think this one is the most skill expressive. What makes it so strong is that it's super flexible for a CC. It can be used to make catches on targets, using the recast to pull them into your team, or you can use it to disengage, shoving divers away from you. Now, as strong as this ability is, it does have its weaknesses. The biggest is that it's a single target ability, so it can be blocked by minions or a champion you're not trying to hit. It's also relatively short range and slow moving compared to the other hooks. For those reasons, in most cases, it's best to use this ability reactively as a follow-up to other CC. Just throwing it out off cooldown in lane isn't actually too successful, and gives your opponents a pretty big window where they can go ahead and move up and safely harass you. One last thing to note is that this ability doesn't get a lower cooldown by putting points into it, nor does the CC get any better. All you get is higher base damage, and for that reason, you'll be maxing it last. RENATA's W is Bailout. RENATA enhances herself or the target allied champion for 5 seconds, granting the target bonus attack speed and bonus movement speed towards visible enemy champions and minions. These bonuses ramp up in effectiveness by 100% over the duration. Bailout's duration resets whenever the target scores a takedown against an enemy champion within 6 seconds of damaging them. If the target takes fatal damage while Bailout is active, they are restored to full HP, but begin burning for a percentage of their maximum health until they reach 0 health. If they score a takedown against an enemy champion within 6 seconds of damaging them, this effect ends, and they are set to 35% of their max health. This effect can only occur once per application of Bailout. This ability is the one that most people consider the most broken in her kit. It synergizes incredibly well with super aggressive ADCs, specifically somebody like Samir that just really wants to jump into the fight. But it's not just limited to diving ADCs. Maybe you have a super fed carry like Jinx or Kog'Maw that does a ton of damage, but the enemy team has somebody with huge bursts like Zed that can go ahead and dive them and blow them up. Being able to let your ADC live through otherwise fatal damage and turn the tables on their would-be killer is pretty damn OP. That said, it's not a completely broken ability. Remember, your ADC has to be able to get a takedown to not die to the bleed out effect. This is the ability that you'll be maxing second since it's the most impactful later on in teamfights. RENATA's E is Loyalty Program. RENATA sends out a Chemtech rocket from either side of her that instantly strikes targets around her. After a short delay, they converge and travel to the target location as a single missile, striking all targets along the path and exploding upon reaching the target location. RENATA and ally struck are granted a shield, and enemies hit are dealt magic damage and slowed by 30% for 2 seconds. This is definitely RENATA's simplest ability, but that by no means makes it bad. In fact, it's a really strong trading tool since it gives you shield while also dealing damage to foes. It makes up almost all of your laning presence, and for that reason, it's definitely the ability that you want to max first. When using this ability in fights, you'll want to use it like a skill shot version of Senna's Q. Try to position it to hit as many allies and enemies as possible. Renata's ultimate is Hostile Takeover. Renata launches a cloud of chemicals that spread out in the target direction and applies Berserk to all enemies and minions that it passes over. Berserk causes afflicted targets to go insane, granting them 100% bonus attack speed and increased size, and forces them to basic attack nearby units, regardless of them being allied, enemy, or neutral. They prioritize attacking their own allies, then neutral units, and then Renata's allies, and lastly, Renata herself. Obviously, this is the craziest ability in Renata's kit. When Viego was released, he gave players a way to take advantage of a fed opponent, kill them, take over their champion, and then use them to mow down the rest of their team. Renata works in a similar way, but she does it even better. For one, you don't even have to wait for them to die to take advantage of them. Then there's also the fact that you get the huge attack speed steroid. If you think a full build Jinx does a lot of damage, just wait until you throw an extra 100% attack speed on her and force her to attack her teammates. Now that we've laid everything out, let's do a bit of a summary of her kit. Renata is definitely one of the hardest supports to play in the game. Both her skill floor and skill ceiling are way above most other champions in the role. And I'm talking about Yuumi. She's technically labeled as an enchanter, but she isn't somebody that you can just use to sit back and mindlessly throw out buffs on a fed ally. Her abilities require timing and positioning. With her cooldowns being relatively long, you'll be heavily punished for making mistakes. Take her W for example. The buff portion of it is kind of like Lulu's W. It gives attack speed and movement speed after all, but it has a much longer cooldown, being 20 seconds at max rank. So instead of just mindlessly throwing it on any single champion, you have to be really intentional on who you choose. It may be best to give it to an ally a few seconds before they get a takedown to guarantee them getting a reset on it. And there's her ult. While the range is massive, the wave moves incredibly slow. Landing your ultimate takes a good positioning, so you can go ahead and try to use it reactively to make sure that it lands. And make sure you avoid layering the CC with somebody else's. For example, if you know that your Mumu is going to look for an engage, wait until you see him land his ultimate to throw yours out. Before we go further, I just want to say that there's a pretty good chance that Renata is going to be hitting the servers with a very low win rate. But don't believe all the people look at the stats and call her bad. This guide is a great starter kit to help put you a step ahead of the rest of the pack, but if you really want to master this champion, I highly recommend that you head over to ProGuides.com. Our challenger level coaches can teach you everything that you need to know in even better detail, so you can go ahead and play her like a pro. But for now, let's talk about how to play Renata, starting with her laning phase. Renata's abilities are definitely strong, but the downside is the long length of her cooldowns. Her W in particular is a whopping 28 seconds, so you want to use that with a bit of discrimination. As we discussed in the ability rundown, her E gives you most of your presence in lane, so you'll be maxing that. While not a direct comparison, I think it kind of works like Nami's W. It's your primary trading tool, so you want to block the damage from your opponent, and allows you to block damage that your opponent is trying to land on you while also poking them. While Renata is classified as an enchanter, she plays entirely different from the rest of the other champions in this class. For one, she puts out a lot more damage, mostly thanks to her Leona-like passive. She's also a lot less susceptible to dying to all lins from the enemy bot lane. Don't get me wrong, she's squishy, so you can't just face tank a ton of damage, but she definitely has the tools to prevent that from happening. Obviously, there's her ultimate, which is huge for turning around fights when either you or your ADC get jumped on. But with that being a fairly long cooldown, you won't have that up for every single engage. That's where her Q comes in. As long as you have the reflexes for it, Renata's Q allows you to disengage anybody that's trying to jump in on you. So make sure that you're not just spamming it aggressively in lane when you're going against somebody like Ali or Leona. Instead, use your E to constantly poke them and reserve Q to disengage anytime that they want to go in. The same logic applies to your ultimate. The cast animation is long and the wave travels slowly, so the enemy bot laners can easily sidestep if you just randomly throw it out. Save it for when your opponents are just trying to force a fight on you. It's especially useful at turning around ganks into easily won 2v3s. Now, let's talk about a few tips for teamfighting as Renata. As I've already mentioned, Renata can have a huge impact in fights, but you really need to understand her kit. It's necessary to position well and time abilities correctly. Aside from your ultimate, her abilities are short-ranged, and make sure that you don't forget about your passive. Weave in autos whenever you can, but don't get caught out of position. The best way to play Renata is walking just close enough to bait the enemy team, then turning the enemy's sloppy engage against them. She's definitely not a champion where you just want to roll your keyboard and spam things off cooldown. Take note of every enemy comp and what you're going to need to do in each fight. In some games, slapping your W on an engager might be the right play, but in others, it might be best to hold it for peel. Like we talked about in the ability rundown, timing your ultimate will be crucial to your success. You need to use it at a time where you're going to be hitting as many opponents as possible, and it needs to be when they aren't all hit by hard CC that will prevent them from killing each other. Don't be afraid to hold it for several seconds after the fight starts. Now to finish things off, let's take a look at the build that you'll want for Renata. For runes, you'll run Summon Airy, Mana Flow Band, Transcendence, Gathering Storm, Font of Life, and Revitalize, with the stat runes being Ability Haste, Adaptive Force, and Armor. If you're worried about an enemy kill lane, you can go for Bone Plating over Revitalize for a safer laning phase. For your items, things are pretty much standard enchanter items. You'll be starting off with Spell Thief's Edge and Rushing Lucidity Boots. After that, you'll go for Imperial Mandate. This item synergizes super well with RENATA, and between it and your passive, you're giving your ally some insane damage amp. After that, you'll want to build towards Staff of Flowing Water, Zanya's Hourglass, and as with most supports, you'll want to top things off with Wardstone. Now you may be wondering why Zanya's on a support. It's not like she's going deep in the fight like Morgana would. Well, the reason is how the stasis from Zanya's and Stopwatch works with RENATA's W. The stasis actually pauses the bleed out timer on RENATA's W, buying an extra 2.5 seconds for your allies to get a takedown to save your life. Plus, having a Zanya's means that you're not going to be wasting your W on yourself at all in the first place, and you can use it on an ally instead. If you feel like Zanya's isn't that necessary just because the enemy team doesn't really have anything that can threaten you, there are a few replacements. You can either buy a standard enchanter item like Ardent or Redemption, or you can pick up a Cosmic Drive. RENATA's long cooldowns means that you get a lot of value out of Ability Haste, so this item is pretty good on her. Plus, the movement speed really helps her lack of mobility. And that wraps things up for our guide to RENATA Glask, the Chem Baroness. Remember, she's going to be a hard champion to master, but once you do, she's going to be incredibly impactful in fights, so she's definitely worth it. And we're always here to help you with that process. And one last thing, before you go, feel free to check out our Discord. The link for that is in the description box below, and we'd really love to have you as part of our community. I can't wait to see you guys back in the next video, but until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and have a wonderful day. Peace.